The title of today is Accelerate Content Creation Without Cutting Corners. So as mentioned, my name is Brian Kavanaugh, and I'm the Director of Global Field and Customer Marketing at Binder.
Yep, and I'm Alice Steer. I am the CEO and one of the co-founders at Gather Content.
All right, so why are we here? As mentioned, we are Binder. We are a leader according to Forrester in digital asset management. I know that this is not the DAM event, but I know that there's a pretty high level of DAM usage and DAM knowledge, right, in this group today. So just show of hands, how many organizations have a DAM in place currently? Yep, just about all, as I suspected, and I imagine if nobody raised their hand, those conversations are at least going on. So if you know Binder, you know that we've been a leader, we've been in this space for a while, and if you know Binder or if you follow the news recently as the last couple months, you know that we acquired the market-leading content operations platform in its category, Gather Content.
Great, thanks Brian. It's incredible to be here today with the Henry Stewart community, and we're absolutely thrilled to be part of the Binder family now with Gather Content. I started my own career in creative and content operations over a decade ago now when I ran my own digital agency. We worked with large global organizations, helping them with their content marketing and website projects. And we typically found that the entire process was absolute chaos. There were so many stakeholders involved, often legal teams, compliance, subject matter experts, and we also found there was lots of localization, translation needs as well. And the penny dropped for us one day where, ahead of an incredibly pressing and high-stakes website launch, the client who was responsible for the final version of the content provided us with a physical shoebox. And I'm not joking, it was a real shoebox. In this box, we had all manner of different content formats. There was a USB drive, there were even print materials, there were actually post-it notes as well. And this was swiftly followed up with the statement that the images were coming in via email, and there was also a Word document for one of the subpages. So it was actually then our responsibility to piece this chaos together and get the content together so we could launch on time and effectively. Unfortunately as well, this wasn't a one-off. We were seeing this time and time again. And we just felt there had to be a better way of getting content through a workflow, making all the people involved feel accountable, and ultimately ensuring that the content quality did not suffer as a result as well, and it wasn't an afterthought. So really at that moment, that was when Gather Content was born. Thank goodness a lot has changed in those 10 years. All of you here have been in this space for a long time. We're seeing a huge investment into content and creative operations. I think organizations have really woken up to the need for this profession and investment here. Specialist roles being hired, platforms and technologies to really ease things along. So yeah, we're really excited to be part of the Binder family, whether it's content, text, assets, images, video, it all needs to go through a process and a workflow. So let's get started today, Brian.
Let's, and so our title, Accelerate Content Creation Without Cutting Corners. That's something that Alice and I love talking about, and I know everyone here is passionate about it, but it's 3 p.m. and there's coffee and snacks waiting for these people, Alice. So
cocktails, hopefully.
Soon enough cocktails as well. So let's break down these terms a little bit in plain speak, such that everyone knows exactly what we're talking about.
Absolutely. So accelerate. What we're seeing more and more is a KPI around the speed of content into the market. It's often being reported at a very high level as well. And we don't just mean proactively here. I think all of your organizations will be incredible at having an editorial pipeline or a content schedule, really knowing how organized you can be and getting that set up in advance. We're also talking about being able to move quickly, reactively as well, having the processes that support that. If you think back, say with COVID, how quickly was your organization able to respond, and were there processes and systems in place that enabled that to happen? Content, this kind of speaks for itself, what we're talking about, all formats of content, all of the building blocks that come together, whether it's assets, text, everything that comes together to create the foundations of a content marketing campaign or an incredible customer and digital experience. And then without cutting corners, so we're getting better at doing it quickly, but there are so many expectations around content now. It needs to meet so many requirements. It's important to do it fast, but we have to do it right here too. We can't choose one or the other. So in terms of those requirements, content must be on brand, it must be following the style guide, it must be hitting the tone of voice of the organization. We might have personalization requirements, SEO optimization, translation, the list goes on and on and on. It's different at every organization for every content type being produced. Most importantly, the content must meet the expectations of the organization that's actually investing into it. It needs to hit those KPIs and drive ROI ultimately. So that's a bit of a preface to what we're going to talk about. And I think, as we said, the million-dollar question is how do we do it right and fast? So, Brian.
And so it's something that we talk about a lot at Binder, and a term that I love, you'll hear me infuse it, throughout this presentation, or if we chat afterwards at the booth, is applying a little bit of science, right? I know a lot of folks here are process-driven, but creativity or sort of creative in nature is a little bit more spontaneous, right? You want it to feel like magic, not like science. And we're not trying to change that magic, but we do want to harness it, right? And so applying a little bit of science, introducing some more metrics to some processes that, let's be honest, didn't always have them, is so, so crucial. And we'll just talk a little bit about how that gets done. And one way, or something that we love, is this idea of SLAs, service level agreements. So show of hands, I don't know how many have some SLA in place between functions. Awesome. So you all know what we're talking about, right? And so we've really seen organizations evolve when they implement an SLA between functions. And personally, when I first got familiar with this concept, it sounded like a big legal document or something that InfoSec has to abide by, right? And if you don't meet the SLA, you give the customer back their money or something. Not exactly what we're talking about, but it is that idea of mutual accountability across parties, across functions. It has to involve all stakeholders, as Alice will get to. And then what it does is when the SLA is not met, it becomes a lot more clear sort of like where the slowdowns are, right? Or you can kind of pinpoint, oh, that's what's holding us up, okay? Alice, I know that you have one story that you told me the other day. It sounded like a horror story, but thankfully there is a happy ending to this one. If you don't mind just sharing with everybody.
Absolutely. So a customer with Gather Content, LPL Financial, big Fortune financial company, has an incredibly mature content operations team. It's really taken seriously at the highest level in the business, and they have KPIs around speed of content to the market. So they take it seriously and have invested into those roles. But they weren't hitting the KPIs. They weren't getting content out fast enough. So they looked very laser focused at where things were hitting a stalling point. And unsurprisingly, it was with the legal and compliance side of the review. Sorry if anyone's from that side here. But ultimately, the content was getting stuck here for sometimes 3 to 4 weeks at a time, which was hugely delaying the initiatives of the content team. So what they then installed was an SLA, service level agreement, that everyone was subscribed to at the highest level. It was an accepted norm for the organization of the rules of engagement here. And they now have that down to a 48-hour review cycle, which is absolutely incredible. And let's look at some other customer examples, because I think there's some exciting stories to tell here too.
100%. I mean, LPL Financial is one. We're going to show a couple here. Our joint customers between Binder and Gather Content, in the thousands of customers, and we're inspired all the time by them, right? And so what we want to do here is just show 4 examples of applying some of those metrics, right, and thinking about this in those SLAs, or how to, again, apply a little bit of that science and data to how creative content gets out to market. And so the first is a company called Zendesk, which is an enterprise technology SaaS brand. Many might be familiar. And so their big sort of metric or ratio that they really pride themselves on and measure is number of creative requests that they fulfill in a year. And they sort of countermeasure that with employee headcount growth, right? And so in the year 2019, they were able to decrease creative requests that came in while their company grew by 65%. And that's just a really good testament to their DAM, right? Because they know that they fully implemented it, and therefore there's self-serve going on. Even as more and more stakeholders are joining the company, needing assets, it's proof point that people just know where to log in. They can search, they can find, they can do whatever they want with the assets. They're not tugging on the shirts of the creatives. Hey, do we have this? Or hey, can you create this for me, right? And then 2 other sort of touch points or proof points rather. One is how many creative requests they're able to resolve in 24 hours. So to that point of turnaround time, they really pride themselves on that. In that year, it was 2 out of every 3, and they want to keep driving that up and up. And then lastly is one-touch resolution of creative requests or asks. And so not having to create a big long thread of what do you need, or hey, what are we going for here? A lot of times it is like that asset does exist, or it's a simple, hey, I need this retouched or something, and that's considered one touch, right? You don't have to go back and forth around what is needed. So again, that's their way of putting a little bit of metrics behind this process, right? And tracking it at kind of a creative request level, and how does that factor into their productivity downstream. Second one is Twilio, another enterprise SaaS technology brand. So what you're looking at here is an excerpt from their quarterly report that their creative and brand team socialize with the rest of their marketing and their executives. And what it does, it is essentially, it's almost like a forecast, the way that a sales team might forecast what they're going to sell that quarter. They forecast what they're going to produce that quarter based on their resources and priorities, right, that are mutually agreed upon ahead of time. So they kind of came to this conclusion that they're 36% above their capacity, and they're using Binder, by the way, right? And so Binder's creative workflow, analytics, and DAM, but they're able to make decisions quickly based on this data, right? And so here's kind of a snapshot of that forecast, right? Over-indexed on graphic design assets, behind on brand infrastructure, and also a little bit over-indexed on video. And so this is something that decision makers or VPs of marketing or brand are really going to sort of take notice and be like, hey, how did we get 50% behind on this brand infrastructure initiative, right? Well, maybe they need to add another resource. And they actually said that it's data like this that plays really well when asking for new headcount or a new contractor, or like, hey, we need some help here, right? And this is the sort of thing that gets their higher ups to take notice.
Brilliant. So on to a Gather Content customer, Boomi, really large scale organization, but they wanted to actually start operating like a startup internally and actually start working in a more agile manner. And they had hugely ambitious goals around increasing the content marketing output and really scaling that up. And this was all going on at a time where huge volumes of new team members were being plugged in and incredibly ambitious goals that they were signing up to. So they got incredibly serious about the process and the science. As you can see from a very beautiful workflow, they had a really clear process around that and different steps that they baked in to get everyone bought into. Flying on to the next example, University of North Dakota. So anyone who has ever worked in higher education, and I do think there's a few people here today who may be in that space, will just know the sheer scale and volume of content that exists. And an example from back in the UK, the University of Edinburgh, at one point, I think it was around 10,000 content management systems they had with no owners and with no workflow behind them. Think about the risk there, the scale of all of that content being online, completely searchable by anyone in the world, hadn't probably been approved properly, nobody knew what versions were being used, and potentially as well, even worse for the organization, it could be inaccurate and factually incorrect, leaving them open to liability. I think all of the Edinburgh stuff's in a good place now, but University of North Dakota did not have that problem, thankfully. Very mature content operations approach there as well, where they have really considered the people, process, and technology elements, invested significantly into building that out and applying the science here. And as you can see, again, the results speak for itself, where they've really been able to scale up the content output whilst ensuring the quality is in place there with the conversions. So I know this slide is about ROI summary. Brian, you want to talk about that? I think we'll skip through it because we're ready for moving on.
We can skip through it. I love talking about the ROI of this stuff, right, and how you show value. If anyone wants to come to the booth later, chat about it, or ask a question, but fair enough, we'll skip it.
Okay, let's move to the next slide.
Deal.
So really, I think this is a practical talk, and we work with so many customers, and we get to see what they're doing and just take things here and there. So this is really the slide. Just take a photo of it, take it back to your team as a conversation starter. It should really be here to inspire rather than to prescribe, essentially. And we've seen these things going on as tactics being used by a lot of our customers. So first up is really mapping the science to the business, really getting obsessed with process and thinking, what does the optimal process look like for each piece of content, each content type, who's involved, what does the workflow look like, where are we failing, where can we improve, and then think about process elements that can be added on here. Establishing the service level agreements, I think if you work with lots of stakeholders, you'll know that your priority is not everyone else's priority, sadly. So by getting a service level agreement in place, I know lots of you already have that maturity, but if not, it's one of the quickest ways to get things moving along much, much faster in your content workflow. On to enabling subject matter experts. I don't want to use another acronym here, but subject matter experts. What we're seeing more and more is that everyone is a content creator in the organization. The best and the most authentic content is coming from people whose day job typically is not in the content and the creative teams. What it is really the thought leadership, that authenticity. So how can we enable those people to take part in the content and know how they should be doing that? So really informing them, really collaborating with them and explaining to them how to go about that. Thinking of text like an asset, I think in the content marketing world, we're really focused on output. It's so important to have output and have a sort of dedicated cadence around things, but we should not be throwing the content over the wall and forgetting about it. We should really see it the way that we do with our digital assets, the sort of images, the files, and the overall sort of reuse approach. And that leads on really well to the final point, which is really a culture for the entire organization to adopt of create once and publish everywhere. We're really familiar with this in the DAM world, but how can we reuse a piece of content, whether that's across channels, repurposing, rehashing it maybe for different audiences and personas. Also, if we've got a global organization, can we regionalize that content or do something further to cascade it across different parts of the world? Not only does this approach give you huge efficiency benefits of not spending more time and money creating the content, but it gives you so much more brand control as well because people aren't reinventing the wheel every single time. So those are a few of the tips that we've seen, things going on in practice in terms of ways to actually accelerate, move quickly with your content output, but also to make sure you're not cutting corners and compromising any of the absolute critical pieces. We'd love to open up some questions.
Yeah, so let's do one or two questions, right, before we wrap up here. And also, if any questions don't get answered or anyone wanted to chat, right, we do have a binder booth over in the exhibition hall. We're also hosting a happy hour down the street once this happy hour concludes, where we'll have some snacks and drinks if anyone was interested and is, staying in town overnight. But yeah, let's do a couple questions before we conclude here, if anyone has them.